The gloves hit the pavement an inch from my sneakers, and the whole street went quiet enough to hear the ice cracking in someone's lemonade. 22-years-old black belt undefeated in 3 amateur cages, and he was smiling at me like I was already on the ground. He had a phone out. He had an audience. What he didn't have was any idea that I'd spent the last 2 decades training men twice his size to survive things he couldn't spell. I looked down at those gloves, then back up at him, and I asked the only question that mattered. "Are you sure?" My name is Ashley Parker. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my adult life, the only people who knew my rank called me Colonel, and meant it with their whole chest. But on Larkspur Lane, in the quiet manicured cul-de-sacs of Cedar Ridge, Colorado, I was just the woman at the end of the street who mowed her own lawn and drove a Ford F-150 with a dent in the tailgate that I never bothered to fix. I moved there in June after my son Ethan finished 9th grade, looking for exactly what the real estate listing promised: peace. 20 years in the Army will do that to you. It teaches you to crave quiet the way other people crave excitement. I'd commanded soldiers in the 75th Ranger Regiment led night operations where the margin for error was the width of a heartbeat, and briefed generals who didn't blink when I corrected them. But none of that mattered here. Here I was, just Ashley, a single mother, a woman who kept to herself, who waved at the mail carrier, and who didn't feel the need to explain what she used to do for a living. I liked it that way. I liked that nobody looked at me twice. The house next door belonged to Richard Coleman, a real estate developer who'd built half the shopping centers on the east side of the county and never let anyone forget it. He drove a white Escalade that he backed into the driveway every single time, engine idling a beat too long, like he wanted the whole block to register his arrival. His son Brandon was 22, home from a semester he'd dropped out of and deep into what he called his fight career. Amateur MMA. A blue belt turned purple, turned black in what felt like record time, though I never once saw him spar with anyone who could actually hurt him. He had 12,000 followers, and a highlight reel set to music that thumped through his open garage every afternoon. I noticed him before he noticed me. That's usually how it goes with men like Brandon. They're so busy being watched that they don't watch back. He revved his motorcycle at 6 in the morning right under my bedroom window 3 days in a row before I even said a word. He took up 2 parking spots outside the community mailbox like it was his personal reserved lot. I watched him once from my porch shoulder check a delivery driver half his size just because the man's cart was blocking the sidewalk for 4 seconds too long. Nobody said anything. That's the thing about neighborhoods like Cedar Ridge. Everyone's polite until the moment politeness costs them something, and then the silence gets very loud. I started running every morning at 5:30 before the sun cracked over the ridge because that's when the world still belonged to me and nobody else. Old habit. In the regiment, 5:30 was already late. Brandon caught me one morning jogging past his driveway in a faded gray t-shirt and running shorts, and he said something to his buddy loud enough that he clearly wanted me to hear it. "She doesn't even look like she could survive 1 round." His friend laughed. I didn't break stride. I didn't turn my head. There's a particular kind of restraint you learn in this life, the kind that has nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with knowing exactly what you're capable of, and choosing deliberately not to prove it to strangers. I smiled instead, not for him, not really, for myself. Because if he'd known even a fraction of what I'd walked through, he would have swallowed those words before they ever left his mouth. I want to be honest about something. Part of me understood him. I'd seen young men like Brandon before, plenty of them before the Army got hold of them and reshaped what they thought strength meant. Boys raised on money and mirrors who confuse aggression with confidence because nobody ever taught them the difference. In another life under different discipline, Brandon might have made a decent soldier. He had the aggression, he just didn't have the humility, and nobody in his life seemed interested in teaching it to him. His father certainly wasn't going to. Richard Coleman treated the neighborhood like an extension of his portfolio, something to be managed, curated, and occasionally reminded of who was really in charge. He was cordial to my face in that specific way. Wealthy men are cordial to people they've already decided don't matter a firm handshake, a joke about the housing market eyes already moving past me before I finished my sentence. I didn't take it personally. I'd met 100 versions of Richard in my life. Men who mistook their bank account for a chain of command. What I didn't expect, what I genuinely didn't see coming that first month, was how quickly Brandon's attention would drift from me to my son. Ethan was 15 that summer, quiet and thoughtful in the way kids get when they've moved around more than most, when they've learned not to get too attached to a school or a street, because the army doesn't ask permission before it reassigns you. He rode his bike up and down Larkspur Lane in the evenings, headphones in, minding his own business. He didn't know anything about combatives or command presence. He knew about video games and a girl in his algebra class and the new skateboard he was saving up for. He was in every way that mattered still just a boy. I watched Brandon watch him one evening from across the street, that same lazy, entitled smile creeping onto his face, and something in my chest went very still and very sharp the way it used to right before a briefing I already knew was going to go badly. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself boys like Brandon eventually got bored and moved on to easier targets. I was wrong. And it wouldn't take long to find out just how wrong I was. There's a particular kind of dread that only parents understand, the one that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles in slowly like weather changing on the horizon. You feel it before you can name it. By the second week of July, I felt it every time I heard Brandon's motorcycle idle a little too long near our end of the street. It started small, the way these things always do. Brandon would drive slow past the cul-de-sac where Ethan and a couple of the neighborhood kids played basketball, revving his engine just enough to scatter them off the asphalt. He'd park his truck sideways across the makeshift court they'd claimed at the end of the block, forcing them to relocate, and he'd sit there in the driver's seat, scrolling his phone, pretending not to notice the game he'd just ended. Twice, I could chalk up to carelessness. By the fourth time, I understood it wasn't carelessness at all. It was a message. This street, this space belonged to him, and everyone else existed on his terms. Then it got personal. I came home from a long day of video conference with Army Futures Command that ran 2 hours, over the kind of day that leaves your jaw sore from clenching it, and found Ethan sitting on our front steps, quiet, in a way that immediately put me on alert. He wasn't crying. My son doesn't cry easily, hasn't since he was maybe 9, but there's a stillness he gets when something's eating at him. A stillness I recognized because I'd seen it in young soldiers after their first hard lesson about the world. "Everything okay?" I asked, setting my bag down slow, giving him room. He shrugged. Brandon called me Mommy's little soldier in front of everyone at the court today. Said it like a joke. Everybody laughed. I felt something tighten low in my stomach, an old and familiar heat I hadn't felt in years, not since the last time I'd watched someone underestimate the people under my command and pay for it. But I kept my voice level because that's the job. That's always been the job, not the absence of anger, but the discipline to not let it drive. "What did you say back?" I asked. "Nothing." What was I supposed to say? I sat down next to him on the step, close enough that our shoulders touched. "Nothing tonight." That's the right answer. Ethan, listen to me. Don't fight people who are desperate to prove something. That kind of hunger, it's bottomless. You can't satisfy it by giving him a reaction. You just feed it. He nodded, but I could tell the words didn't land the way I wanted them to. 15-year-olds don't run on wisdom. They run on humiliation and the desperate need to undo it. I understood that. I'd been 15 once too, though it felt like a different woman's life by now. I hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 10 days later, on a warm Saturday afternoon that should have been unremarkable, I was inside prepping dinner when I heard raised voices outside Brandon's laugh, cutting through the open kitchen window, sharp and performative. I stepped onto the porch and found Ethan standing over his bike, which was on its side in the middle of the street front wheel, still spinning chain half off the sprocket. Brandon stood a few feet away with his phone raised, filming, grinning at the screen like he was building toward a punchline. "Say it again," Brandon was saying clearly to the camera and not to Ethan. "Say what you called me." Ethan's face was red, jaw tight, hands curled at his sides in that helpless, furious way kids get when they're outmatched and know it. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I walked the same measured pace I'd use approaching a situation that needed control, not chaos, because chaos is exactly what an aggressor wants from you. It confirms they've gotten under your skin. "Pick up the bike," I said. Not loud. I didn't need loud. Brandon lowered the phone just enough to look at me, that same lazy smirk still hanging off his face. Or what? I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him. Really looked the way you look at a threat assessment, cataloging without judgment, without heat, just information. His stance was loose weight forward, the posture of someone used to being the most dangerous person in any room he walked into. His eyes, though, flickered for half a second under my gaze. Something involuntary and small, a flash of uncertainty. He probably didn't even register himself. I've seen that flicker in men 3 times his size right before they decide it's smarter to back down than to test the thing standing in front of them. For a moment I thought he might actually pick up the bike. That's when Richard's Escalade pulled into the driveway, and he stepped out mid-phone call, taking in the scene with the mild irritation of a man interrupted during something important. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask if Ethan was okay. He looked at me, standing on the street in my gardening clothes, dirt still on my knees from the flower bed I'd been working, and something about my stillness seemed to amuse him. "You military people," he said, finishing his call and slipping the phone into his blazer pocket, "always think rank matters outside the base." I could have said a dozen things in that moment. I could have told him exactly what rank had taught me, exactly what it meant to hold the line, when everyone around you wanted to break formation, exactly how many young men and women I'd watched grow into people far better than the boy currently filming my son's humiliation for likes. Instead, I said nothing. I picked up Ethan's bike myself, set it upright, and walked it back toward our garage while my son trailed behind me, confused and a little embarrassed by my silence. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked once we were inside, voice cracking with something between frustration and disappointment. Because he wanted a reaction, I told him, setting the bike against the wall. And I don't hand out what people want from me just because they're loud enough to demand it. But that night, lying awake long after Ethan had gone to bed, I felt the old current stirring underneath my calm. The same current I used to feel the night before an operation, when stillness on the surface meant something entirely different was moving underneath. I understood with total clarity that this wasn't over. Boys like Brandon didn't stop because you walked away. They stopped when the world finally showed them undeniably that walking away had never once been the same thing as being afraid. I just didn't know yet how public that lesson was about to become. Labor Day in Cedar Ridge was an institution. Every year the HOA closed off half of Larkspur Lane, folding tables went up under string lights, someone's smoker filled the whole cul-de-sac with the smell of brisket by noon, and every family on the street showed up whether they liked their neighbors or not. It was the one day a year the entire community occupied the same square of pavement, and by 4 in the afternoon that square of pavement was packed. I almost didn't go. I'd had a rough week, a budget review that ran long, a phone call with a general who liked to hear himself talk, the low hum of exhaustion that never fully leaves you no matter how many years you've been doing the job. But Ethan wanted to go, wanted a normal afternoon with normal neighborhood kids doing normal neighborhood things, and after the summer he'd had, I wasn't about to deny him that. We arrived a little after 3. I wore jeans and an old gray Henley hair pulled back, nothing that would draw a second look. That was always the point. I brought a bowl of pasta salad because that's what you bring to these things, and I found a spot near the Hendersons' driveway where I could keep half an eye on Ethan while he threw a football around with a couple of boys his age. Brandon showed up around 4 already, a few beers in, moving through the crowd with the loose, expansive energy of someone who knew he was the most physically imposing person at the party, and had decided that fact entitled him to the floor. He'd brought his fight highlight reel up on somebody's phone at one point, narrating his own knockouts like a sports announcer, and the small cluster of people around him laughed at all the right moments. The way people laugh when they're humoring someone rather than genuinely entertained. I watched it from a distance, sipping lemonade, saying nothing, wanting nothing more than to get through the afternoon without incident. Around 5, the sun dipping low enough to turn everything gold, Brandon's voice rose above the general chatter of the party, that particular pitch men get when they've had just enough alcohol to mistake volume for charisma. "Anybody here think they can beat me?" he called out, arms spread, grinning at the crowd like he already knew the answer. "Come on, anybody, I'll go easy." Nobody answered. A few uncomfortable laughs. Somebody's dad shook his head and turned back to the grill. The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was the silence of people who found him exhausting, but didn't want the confrontation of saying so out loud. That silence seemed to bother Brandon more than an outright challenge would have. He scanned the crowd, and I felt it before I saw it the exact moment his eyes landed on me standing near the drink table with my lemonade, unremarkable, unbothered. "What about you, Colonel?" he said, and the crowd's attention shifted toward me like a tide changing direction. He'd taken to calling me that as a joke months ago, a mocking little nickname because Ethan had let it slip once that I served. And Brandon had decided it was funny a woman with a rank nobody in the neighborhood took seriously. "You're always so quiet, so calm. I bet you think you could take me." I didn't answer. I took a sip of my lemonade. He crossed the pavement toward me, unzipping the small gym bag he'd apparently brought for exactly this moment, and pulled out a pair of MMA gloves red and worn from use, and dropped them at my feet. They hit the concrete with a soft thud that somehow silenced the entire block. String lights swayed overhead. Someone's phone came up already filming. I felt every eye on that street turn toward us at once. "Come on, Colonel," Brandon said loud enough for everyone to hear that same performative grin plastered across his face. "Put your money where your mouth is." "I haven't said a word," I said quietly. "Exactly." He shot back, playing to the crowd now feeding off the attention. "You never do. You just walk around here acting like you're better than everybody, like you know something the rest of us don't. So show us. Or is the tough guy act just for civilians who don't know any better?" I felt Ethan's eyes on me from across the yard, frozen mid-throw football forgotten in his hands. I felt Richard's presence too, drifting closer with his phone already raised, that same amused superiority on his face, the look of a man who fully expected this to end in his son's favor and wanted documentation of it. I looked down at the gloves, then back up at Brandon. "Are you sure?" I asked him, calm, even, the exact tone I'd have used briefing a room full of colonels twice his age about an operation that carried real risk. Something flickered across his face, that same half-second hesitation I'd caught weeks earlier in the street, quickly buried under bravado. "Scared," he said louder now for the crowd. I reached up and unclasped my watch, handing it without a word to Mrs. Henderson standing nearby, who took it with wide eyes and an expression somewhere between alarm and disbelief. I walked to where Ethan stood, took my phone from my pocket, and handed it to him. "Stand behind the fence," I told him quiet enough that it was just between us. "Whatever happens, stay there." He looked at me like he wanted to ask 100 questions at once, but something in my face must have told him this wasn't the moment. He nodded and backed toward the fence-line phone, clutched in both hands, eyes wide. The crowd had gone fully silent now, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your ears. Somebody turned off the music that had been playing from a speaker on someone's porch. Richard stood near the front of the gathered onlookers' phone, raised, filming his son's opponent with the confident ease of a man who had already decided how this story would end. I stepped out of my sandals and onto the warm pavement in bare feet. The September sun sitting low and orange over the rooftops of Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows across a street that was about to learn something about the woman who lived at the end of it. Brandon rolled his neck, bounced once on the balls of his feet, and slid his hands into the gloves he'd have no time to actually use. "I didn't put on gloves. I didn't need them." "Whenever you're ready," I said. The whole block held its breath. Brandon came at me exactly the way I expected him to. Cage fighters, even amateur ones, are trained to close distance fast, to use aggression as a weapon before technique even enters the equation. He lunged forward with a looping right hand, more show than substance, the kind of strike designed to look devastating on a highlight reel, rather than actually land clean on someone who knew what they were doing. I'd seen that exact shape of aggression 1,000 times before in training rooms, and in places far less forgiving than a suburban cul-de-sac with string lights overhead. I didn't throw a single punch back. Not one, not for the entire fight. That decision wasn't mercy, not yet. It was strategy. A man who's used to being the most dangerous person in the room reads a counterpunch as confirmation that he's in a fight worth having. I wasn't interested in confirming anything for Brandon. I was interested in ending this as quickly and as cleanly as possible. I slipped his first strike with a small pivot of my hips, barely more than a shift in weight, and his momentum carried him half a step past me. The crowd made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a murmur, the specific noise people make when their expectations get quietly rearranged. Brandon recovered fast. I'll give him that he had genuine athleticism buried under all that bravado, and spun back toward me with a low kick aimed at my thigh. I stepped inside it instead of away, closing the distance he desperately wanted to control, and caught his extended arm in an arm drag that used his own forward momentum against him. It's a simple technique, old as grappling itself, but simple only works if your timing is exact, and 20 years of training had given me nothing if not exact timing. He stumbled forward off balance, and before he could reset his stance, I had my hip against his one arm hooked around his waist in a body lock that took away everything he needed: space leverage, the ability to generate power in any strike. He tried to muscle out of it. Brandon was strong, genuinely strong, the kind of gym-built strength that looks impressive under fluorescent lighting and video filters. But strength without structure just burns itself out fast, and I felt the exact moment his breathing changed, the exact moment his shoulders started working harder than they needed to, because his technique had abandoned him under pressure. I swept his lead foot clean and simple and put him on the ground. The crowd's murmur sharpened into something closer to shock. Brandon scrambled back up almost immediately, jaw tight now, all the performance drained out of his face and replaced with something rawer, something closer to the truth of what was actually happening. He came at me again faster this time, more desperate, throwing a combination that had real intent behind it. I felt the first punch graze past my ear close enough that the air moved, and something in my chest went cold and sharp and entirely completely calm. The exact stillness I used to feel in the seconds before a breach when your body knows exactly what it's built to do and simply does it. I stepped behind him. It happened fast enough that I doubt more than a handful of people in that crowd actually saw the mechanics of it. A rear clinch, hips dropping low, a trip that took his base out from under him, before he even registered I'd moved. He hit the pavement hard, the wind audibly leaving him, and I was down with him before he could scramble away. Weight settled across his back, controlling the fight from a position he had absolutely no training to escape from. Every grappling exchange from that point forward was a foregone conclusion. He knew it. I could feel him know it in the way his struggling shifted from strategic to purely instinctive. The flailing of someone who understood on some animal level that he was no longer the one in control of what happened to his body. I secured his shoulder, isolated the arm, and locked it in place with the kind of control that made further struggle not just useless but genuinely dangerous for him if he kept fighting it. Then I shifted to his neck, a controlled hold, nothing designed to hurt, only to communicate with total clarity that this was finished whenever I decided it was finished. I never threw a single punch. Not once the entire fight. I want that understood clearly because it mattered to me in that moment and to everyone watching. This was never about hurting him. It was about ending something he'd started and refused over and over again to end himself. He tapped my forearm twice fast, the universal signal breath ragged and desperate beneath me. I released him instantly. No hesitation, no lingering, no extra second held just to make a point. The moment he tapped it was over completely the way it should always be. I got to my feet first, and extended a hand down to him, and after a long beat, pride visibly warring with exhaustion on his face, he took it, and I pulled him up. The whole street was silent. Not a single phone lowered. Not a single word spoken. 75 seconds by the timestamp on somebody's video that circulated later, though it felt both shorter and infinitely longer while it was happening. Brandon stood there in the fading gold light chest, heaving gloves still on hands that had never once landed a real strike, staring at me like he was seeing an entirely different person than the woman he'd mocked for months. I leaned in close enough that only he could hear me. "Winning isn't the same as humiliating someone," I said. "I want you to remember that I had 100 chances to hurt you tonight, and I didn't take a single one. That was a choice. I need you to understand it was a choice." He didn't say anything back. He just nodded once, something in his face cracking open in a way that had nothing to do with the fight itself. I turned and looked for Ethan behind the fence and found him standing frozen, my phone forgotten in his hand, eyes wide with something I hadn't seen on his face in a very long time. Not fear, not shock exactly, but a kind of dawning recognition, like a puzzle piece finally sliding into place. I walked to him, put my hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Let's go home." Behind us, I heard Richard's voice cut through the silence, sharp and furious, already reaching for his phone with a different purpose now. "That's assault," he was shouting to no one in particular, to everyone at once. "Somebody call the police. She assaulted my son." I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I already knew exactly how this was going to end, and it wasn't going to end the way Richard Coleman thought it would. The police arrived within 20 minutes, 2 cruisers pulling up quietly at the edge of the cul-de-sac, while half the neighborhood still stood frozen in the deepening dusk plates of half-eaten barbecue forgotten on folding tables. Richard had called it in himself breathless and indignant, using words like assault and unprovoked attack, before the officers had even stepped out of their vehicles. I stood with Ethan near our driveway, arms crossed loosely waiting, because I've learned that the worst thing you can do in a moment like that is act like you have something to hide. The younger of the 2 officers approached me, first notepad already out, and asked what happened. I told him plainly. Brandon had challenged me, publicly thrown gloves at my feet in front of dozens of witnesses, and I'd accepted a fight he initiated on his terms, using techniques designed to control and end the encounter without causing harm. I told him I never struck him once, not a single punch. He looked skeptical. Understandably, that's not usually how these stories go. But then people started coming forward, unprompted, phones already in hand. Mrs. Henderson, still holding my watch, played her video without being asked. The Delgados from 3 houses down had a clearer angle, catching the entire exchange from the moment the gloves hit the ground. A teenager who'd been filming for his own social media account had 11 seconds of Brandon shouting, "Put your money where your mouth is," in crisp, unmistakable audio. By the time 4 different videos had been reviewed on the spot, the picture was undeniable. I hadn't attacked anyone. I'd been baited into a fight I tried repeatedly to avoid, and I'd ended it without ever raising a fist. No charges were filed that night. The older officer, a heavy-set man with kind, tired eyes, actually pulled me aside as he was leaving and said low enough that only I could hear, "For what it's worth, ma'am, that was about as clean as I've ever seen someone handle a situation like that." I thanked him and didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else that needed saying. Richard, for his part, did not let it go. Not that night, not that week, not that month. I understood somewhere in the weeks that followed that men like Richard Coleman don't experience public humiliation the way most people do. It doesn't register as embarrassment to be absorbed and moved past. It registers as a debt that must be collected, a wound that demands repayment, and he apparently decided very quickly that if the legal system wasn't going to hand him satisfaction, he'd manufacture it some other way. He hired a private investigator. I found this out secondhand through a neighbor who worked at the same law firm the investigator used to source records, a woman named Diane, who felt enough discomfort about the whole situation to give me a quiet heads-up over the fence one afternoon. Richard wanted everything: my employment history, my financial records, anything that might give him leverage to make my life difficult in ways that had nothing to do with what had actually happened at that party. What the investigation turned up instead was the truth about who I actually was. 22 years of service, multiple deployments, command experience in the 75th Ranger Regiment that most civilians, even well-connected ones like Richard, had no real frame of reference for understanding, decorations he'd never heard of and couldn't properly research the significance of. A current posting at Army Futures Command that put me in rooms with people whose names occasionally made it into defense industry newsletters, Richard actually subscribed to, though he'd apparently never made the connection between those names and his quiet neighbor with the dented pickup truck. I found out later through Diane again that this revelation didn't discourage him. If anything, it seemed to embolden him, further feeding some belief that a woman with that kind of career had powerful people to answer to, people who might be persuaded that she'd embarrassed the Army by brawling with a civilian at a neighborhood barbecue. He began drafting letters, formal ones on his company letterhead addressed to the Department of Defense, alleging conduct unbecoming, demanding an official inquiry into my actions. I learned about the letters before they were even sent because Richard in his confidence mentioned it to another neighbor at the mailbox, clearly hoping word would spread and reach me, hoping the mere threat would be enough to make me anxious, apologetic, smaller. He wanted to see me sweat. He wanted, I think, some visible confirmation that he still held power over the situation, power he'd felt slipping away from him ever since his son tapped out on his own front lawn in front of the whole block. I didn't sweat. I want to be honest about that, not out of arrogance, but because I understood something Richard fundamentally didn't. I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd defended myself. I'd defended my dignity, and I'd done it with more restraint than most people would have managed under the circumstances. There was no version of an honest inquiry that ended badly for me. The only real question was what an inquiry into Richard's motivations might turn up. Instead, a question I hadn't even thought to ask yet, but one that the universe, or something very close to it, was already quietly answering. Ethan asked me one night sitting at the kitchen table over dinner whether I was worried. I remember exactly what I told him because I meant every word of it. Worry is for situations you don't understand, I said. I understand this one completely. Richard is a man who has never once in his entire life faced consequences for the way he treats people who don't have his money. He genuinely believes that will hold true forever. I've watched men like that before, Ethan. It never holds true forever. He didn't look entirely convinced. He was 15, and 15 doesn't yet believe that patience is its own kind of weapon. But he trusted me enough to let it go to finish his dinner to go back to being a kid worried about algebra tests instead of federal complaints. I trusted something else entirely, something I'd learned a long time ago in far harder circumstances than this one. When you build your entire life on cutting corners, on leaning on money and influence instead of integrity, that foundation eventually cracks under its own weight. You don't need to push it, you just need to wait and let the structure do what unstable structures always eventually do. I didn't know yet how quickly or how completely that structure was about to come down, but I had a feeling. And in my experience, feelings like that are rarely wrong. The letter landed on the desk of Lieutenant General Michael Donovan on a Tuesday morning in late September, tucked into a stack of routine correspondence his aide had already flagged for review. I only know the specifics of what happened next because Michael told me himself weeks later over a phone call that started serious and ended with both of us laughing harder than either of us had in months. Michael and I went back a long way. We'd served together early in my career before he climbed into the rarefied air of 3-star command, and I settled into the work I do now at Futures Command. He wasn't just a colleague. He was one of the handful of people who'd watched me grow from a green second lieutenant into someone who could hold a room of colonels silent with a single sentence, and he had over the years developed what I can only describe as a very specific, very dry sense of humor about anyone foolish enough to underestimate me. He told me later that he read the first paragraph of Richard's letter, an aggrieved account of conduct unbecoming an officer, involving an unprovoked physical assault at a private social gathering, and had to set it down for a moment because he was laughing too hard to keep reading. Ashley Parker. He told me he'd said out loud to an empty office, "Got challenged to a fight and this man is mad she won." But amusement is not the same as dismissal, and Michael, whatever else he is, has always been thorough. An inquiry was opened exactly as Richard had hoped it would be. Statements were requested, video evidence of which there was an abundance given how many phones had been recording that Labor Day evening was reviewed in full. Within days, it was clear beyond any reasonable dispute that I had done nothing except respond with considerable restraint to a challenge that had been thrown at my feet in front of dozens of witnesses. The inquiry into my conduct closed almost as quickly as it opened with a formal note in the record, commending the composure I'd shown under public provocation. But inquiries once opened have a way of generating their own momentum, and somewhere in the process of verifying the basic facts of the incident, someone on Michael's staff pulled Richard Coleman's business background as a matter of due diligence standard procedure when a formal complaint involves a private citizen making serious allegations against a serving officer. What they found had nothing to do with me at all, and everything to do with the very foundation Richard Coleman had built his comfortable life upon. Richard's real estate development firm had for years been bidding on municipal contracts, including several tied to public infrastructure projects that received partial federal funding. That connection, thin as it might have seemed, was enough to draw the attention of people whose job it is to notice when federal money intersects with irregularities. And once they started looking, they found quite a lot. Falsified bid documentation on at least 3 contracts. A network of shell subsidiaries that existed as far as anyone could determine for no purpose other than allowing Richard's firm to sidestep local minority contractor requirements while appearing to comply with them on paper. Payments to a county zoning official that once traced through several intermediary accounts looked far less like consulting fees and far more like what they actually were. I want to be clear about something, because it matters to me that this story is told honestly. I did not orchestrate this. I made no calls, wrote no letters, pulled no strings. I have never in my entire career used my position to settle a personal grievance, and I wasn't about to start over a neighborhood dispute involving a man who threw gloves at my feet at a barbecue. What happened to Richard Coleman happened because Richard Coleman built his empire on a foundation of dishonesty, and he made the singular catastrophic error of inviting official scrutiny into his own life at the exact moment that scrutiny was primed to look closely at everyone involved. The Defense Contract Audit Agency got involved first given the federal funding tied to some of his projects. Then the FBI once the zoning payments surfaced clean enough to warrant a proper investigation. The IRS followed not long after once his shell company structure came under examination and raised the kinds of red flags that auditors dream about. Within 6 weeks of sending a letter meant to destroy my career, Richard Coleman found himself the subject of 3 separate federal inquiries, his development contracts frozen pending review, tens of millions of dollars in projects suspended indefinitely. I heard about all of it in pieces, the way you hear about a house collapsing from 2 streets over the Sounds. First, then the dust, then eventually the full shape of what happened. Diane, my neighbor with connections at the law firm, kept me loosely updated always, with the same note of disbelief in her voice. "He did this to himself," she said to me once, almost in wonder. "He had a legitimate business. He didn't need to cut those corners. He just couldn't help it." Brandon's world came apart on a parallel smaller track. The gym where he trained, sensing the shift in his father's reputation, and unwilling to be associated with either the viral video of his defeat or the mounting federal scrutiny surrounding his family, quietly suspended his membership citing conduct concerns related to the Labor Day incident, which had by then been viewed close to 2 million times across various platforms. His sponsors, a regional supplement company, and a local gym apparel brand, both issued polite, carefully worded statements distancing themselves from him within the same week. The highlight reels stopped. The captions stopped. For the first time since I'd moved to Cedar Ridge, Brandon's garage stayed quiet in the mornings. I felt something complicated watching all of this unfold. Something that wasn't triumph, not exactly. I'd spent my whole career believing that consequences, real consequences, tend to find people eventually, without needing anyone to manufacture them. I hadn't wanted this for Richard, not specifically, not with this scale. I'd simply wanted to be left alone to raise my son in peace, to live the quiet life I'd earned after 2 decades of service. But I also understood watching it happen that this wasn't really about me at all. It never had been. Richard Coleman's downfall had been built years before I ever moved on to Larkspur Lane. I had simply been the thread that once pulled unraveled something that had been fraying all along. Ethan asked me one evening in October, watching the news cover a local segment about the fraud investigation, whether I felt bad about it. I thought about that question longer than I expected to. "No," I told him, finally. "I feel bad for anyone who has to watch their family fall apart. That's a hard thing to witness even when the person falling built the entire collapse themselves. But I don't feel responsible for it, Ethan, and neither should you. We didn't do this. We just stopped absorbing what wasn't ours to carry, and everything else followed its own gravity." By late November, the Coleman house sat with a for sale sign planted crooked in the front lawn, the kind of sign that goes up when a family is selling out of necessity rather than choice. I watched it from my porch some mornings, coffee in hand, and I felt none of the satisfaction I might have expected to feel back in September, when Richard was still filming my fight with his son and shouting about assault to a police officer who clearly wasn't buying it. Watching a family lose their home doesn't feel like victory. It just feels heavy in a different, quieter way than everything that came before it. The bank foreclosed in early December. I found out from Diane, who'd become something like a genuine friend over those months, that Richard's legal fees alone had eaten through whatever cash reserves the family had left once the federal investigations gathered speed, and once his development contracts stayed frozen through the fall building season. The income simply stopped coming in fast enough to cover what he owed. They moved out on a gray Tuesday morning. A moving truck backed into the driveway where Brandon used to rev his motorcycle at 6 a.m., and by that afternoon the house was empty and the street was quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet since before I'd moved in. Nobody threw a party about it. Nobody gathered at the mailbox to gossip with any real relish. I think in the end most of the neighborhood had simply grown tired of the noise the Colemans brought with them everywhere they went, and their absence felt less like a triumph and more like an exhale, a street finally allowed to settle back into itself. Brandon came to see me the week before they left. I remember being surprised by the knock on my door, surprised further to find him standing there alone. No phone in hand, no audience, nothing performative about the way he stood on my porch, with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, shoulders drawn in a way I'd never seen on him before. He looked younger than 22 in that moment. He looked honestly like a kid who'd finally run out of road. I wanted to say something before we go. He said, not quite meeting my eyes at first. I've been thinking about it a lot. The fight. Everything before it, too. The stuff with Ethan's bike, the way I talked to you, all of it. He paused, jaw working like the words were harder to get out than he'd expected. I should have listened to all of it. You tried to tell me something that day at the party, and I was too busy trying to look tough in front of a camera to actually hear it. I stood in my doorway and looked at him for a long moment. This young man who'd spent months treating our street like his personal stage, now standing there with something genuinely humbled in his posture. I thought about all the ways I could respond, all the things I could have said about accountability, about the family he was leaving behind, about the version of himself he'd have to build from scratch somewhere new. In the end, I kept it simple because I found that the truest things usually are. Strength isn't measured by who you can beat, I told him. It's measured by who you choose not to hurt. You had 100 chances that day to walk away before it ever got to gloves on the ground, and you didn't take a single one of them. That's the lesson here, Brandon. Not the fight. What happened before the fight? He nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something behind his eyes that looked like it might actually stick. Can I say sorry to Ethan? He asked. Before we go, I called Ethan down from his room and I watched from the kitchen doorway as the two of them stood on my porch. Brandon apologizing in a voice stripped of all its old bravado. Ethan listening with the particular grace that 15-year-olds sometimes surprise you with, the grace of someone who never needed revenge to feel whole, only acknowledgement. They shook hands. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was just two boys in their own way closing a door that had been open and swinging too long. The Colemans moved 3 states away, somewhere Richard apparently had extended family, who could offer him a fresh start once the legal dust settled. I heard secondhand that he eventually pled to a reduced set of charges, paid substantial restitution, and lost his contractor's license permanently. I didn't feel the need to follow the story much further than that. Some chapters close on their own, and you don't need to read every page to understand how the book ends. Cedar Ridge went back to being exactly what the listing had promised me back in June: quiet, unremarkable, peaceful, in the specific way that only comes after storms pass through and clear out. I still run every morning at 5:30, same gray shirt, same worn-in shoes, same empty street humming with early light before the rest of the neighborhood wakes up. But something's different now. Something small, but real. The neighbors who used to look past me, who never quite registered the woman at the end of the street, stop now. They wave. Sometimes they walk out to their mailboxes a little early just to say good morning, and I always say it back because that's what neighbors do when the noise finally clears enough to hear each other properly. Ethan's doing well. He made varsity soccer that spring, And he doesn't talk about that summer much anymore, though. Every once in a while, when someone at school tries to push him around the way Brandon once did, I notice he doesn't flinch the way he used to. He just watches calm, unbothered, the exact stillness I spent 20 years learning myself quietly passed down, without either of us ever really discussing it. I think about that whole season often, honestly. Not with anger, not anymore. With something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds. Because it taught me all over again something I'd already learned once in a much harder place, under much harder circumstances, that patience isn't passivity, and walking away isn't weakness, and the people who mistake your restraint for fear are always eventually the ones who learn the hardest lesson of all. Bullies mistake patience for weakness. They never realize that the strongest people are usually the last ones looking for a fight. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where it found you today. Drop a comment below and tell me what part hit hardest. I read every single one. And if you're the kind of person who believes quiet strength always wins in the end, hit subscribe, because we've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you week after week. Let's keep this journey going together.